God's word for our meditation today comes from our first reading, our Old Testament reading. I'll reread a couple of verses for us again. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." This is God's word. Isn't it so true in our lives that when things are bad, everything just seems to be going bad in our lives? There's almost no redeeming qualities, right? Everything just comes pouring down on us all at once. Because it's so hard to see the light within the darkness. It's hard to find the blessings amidst the suffering. You know, when it rains, it pours. People say that all the time, and nothing seems to be going our way. Or maybe on the flip side of the coin, when things are going well, we expect things to keep going that trajectory, right? We don't want the good times to stop. And that's kind of how the Israelites felt at this moment in time as they were making their way to the Promised Land. And we know, in a general sense, the disposition of the Israelites after they left Egypt. Right? They would face a challenging time in their journey. They would complain. Something bad would happen. They would cry out to God. God would save them. And then things would go well for a while again, and then they would face another challenging time, and then they would complain, and then the cycle just continued. For 40 years, it seemed like this kept happening to them. And in the previous chapter before our reading, we see Moses and Aaron, the leaders of God's people, become so frustrated with their complaining that they even rebelled against God in an act of defiance, and they lost their opportunity to step foot into the Promised Land. But it was still their duty to bring the people to the gates of the Promised Land, and so they continued leading God's people. So now, as the Israelites are making their way to Canaan, the Promised Land, they found themselves on the border of the country of Edom. Now, the Edomites were descendants of Abraham through his grandson Esau, so they shared similar ancestors. And they wanted to pass through Edom because this was the shortest route to the Promised Land. It would be much safer for them to go through Edom than to go into the wilderness again. So Moses sent this message to the king of Edom, asking him and explaining everything that happened to them up to this point. All right, Moses said, "We were enslaved in Egypt, and we faced genocide because and he saved us, and all we would like to do is pass through your country on the King's Highway. We will be polite guests. We won't eat or drink anything unless we pay for it. Same goes for our animals. All we're asking is to get from point A to point B. You'll never know we were here." But the king of Edom said no on multiple occasions, and even sent his army to intimidate the Israelites into taking a long detour. And so now the Israelites are on this longer path, and then they run into another enemy Canaanite nation that they have to face. And so the Israelites pray to God to give their enemy into their hands, to give them the victory. And God did give them the victory. And as they continued walking on this longer path, and as they continued walking, the more impatient they became in their journey. Now, remember, they're doing this on foot, in tough, hot terrain. This is not just a nice stroll down the sidewalk. Because the distance from Egypt to Canaan, if they would have taken the straightest path, should have taken them 11 days. And now it is taking them 40 years because of their sin and because of their rebellion against God. And we can see why God would become frustrated with his people if this cycle of complaining and salvation kept happening. And not only for the Israelites was the walking part bad, but then everything just became awful to them. Right? They complained that God rescued them from Egypt. Even though they were facing genocide, they were slaves, And they were the ones to say, God, please rescue us. And God did. And now they're saying, why did God rescue us from Egypt? Things were much better when we were slaves. And then they complained about their food, that the food wasn't good, that the water wasn't great, even though God was providing them those blessings every single day. And they even went so far as to call the manna that God gave them 6 days a week as miserable and worthless. But the manna had a purpose, right? It was worth something. It was keeping them alive. They ate it 6 days a week. They collected double on Fridays, and now they're getting sick of it. And the 40 years was almost up. They were at the last lap, almost to the finish line, and the light was at the end of the tunnel, but they lost focus. They couldn't see the blessings. They just saw all of the horrible stuff happening in front of them. So then the snakes came. And they bit the people, and some people died, but then some came to Moses confessing their sin. And they asked Moses to pray to God for them to give a solution, and God did. God said, put a snake on a pole, look at it, and live. Look up at the problem that you are facing and live. And so the people who were suffering from the searing pain of these venomous snake bites only had to look to an image of a snake and they would be saved. And God could have done this any other way, as we like to say a lot in the Bible. God could have saved his people with a breath, with the word of his mouth. He could have waved his healing hand over the Israelites and they would have been saved. But instead, God placed his promises in something the people could look up to and see, and then they would be saved. And in just these few verses in our reading today, we see this cycle of sin and judgment and mercy and salvation, and that happens so often in our lives too. Because it's so easy for us to look at the Israelites, and we know their history, and we say, are they ever going to learn their lesson? Right? Are they ever going to put their full trust in God, knowing that he will take them to the promised land because God never goes back on his promises? Right? Was the walking and the manna really that bad? I mean, were leftovers really that bad? After 40 years of leftovers, I might get a little sick of it too. But it was such a slippery slope for them. They just made a vow to God before our reading today, and they kept looking at the problem that was right in front of them instead of looking up to God as they approached the promised land. And we can roll our eyes and we can chuckle at their attitudes, but how often is that us? Right? Paul even pointed this situation out in 1 Corinthians 10 as a warning to us. Don't be like them, Paul said. It's recorded for us for a reason so we can learn from their lesson. But how short-sighted we can be too in our lives when things are going wrong. Because we can so easily have our heads to the ground, complaining when things go wrong. Now, it's said that when you are out walking in the woods or in the wilderness, off trail, you should always keep your eyes on something far in the distance, right? Keep your head up looking forward. Because if you're too busy looking down at your feet, slowly you will start to walk in circles and then you get lost. It's always good to keep your head up and focused on an object ahead. And in our lives, it's easy for us to act like the Israelites because when things go right, like God giving them the victory, we want things to keep going in that direction, right? Maybe we pay off the car loan and we're like, yes, finally, now we have a little bit of freedom, and then a tree falls on the house and we have to take out another loan for that. Or maybe we ask ourselves, why can't things go well for just 1 week? Why can't there just be a week? Oh, that's all I'm asking of things not going wrong in my life. Maybe the doctor gives you a clean bill of health, you're on the up and up, and then you are smashed and drowning with medical bills or another injury you receive. And one thing goes wrong after another, and then we so easily jump off the bandwagon, and then everything just seems to come crashing down on us. right? The dryer broke, the furnace is acting up, the kids are sick again, work is frustrating, the raise I wanted wasn't the raise that I got, and soon all of the blessings that are right in front of our eyes that we receive every day just disappear. And then all the negatives come flooding into our hearts, and slowly that starts affecting our souls. Because we have our heads down and we're focused on the problem right now, that we forget to look up at the God who loves us and the God who saves us. We focus on the negatives here and now, but we forget the glory in heaven that awaits us in the not-so-distant future. And we can't help but read this Old Testament reading in light of our gospel reading, because Jesus brings it up, and he likens himself to the snake. Right? He was lifted up on the cross for the problem of sin, that all people who are poisoned by sin could look to him and live. For the Israelites, snakes were the problem. And God told them, look at the problem that you're facing and live. Because hidden behind the sinful problem was God's promise to save. Right? Likewise, we look to the cross, not because Jesus himself was the problem, but because he took our problems to the cross to save us. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. And so we look to the cross with Jesus on it, and we see our sin that leads to death. That's the problem affecting us. We have been bitten by the sin snake. We are poisoned by sin. And so God sent Jesus to be the embodiment of sin, carrying every single one of them, so that we only need to look to him to receive life. And that's how it had to be. It had to be God. It could not be ourselves. You know, I wonder if the Israelites had snake bite remedies. Because no doubt, being in the climate that they were in, being in the place they were in, they would have faced snakes as they were wandering in the wilderness. And I wonder if they had methods of extracting the venom or pain medications that they would take from natural sources. But how in this situation those didn't work. People were dying because of these snakes. They needed God. And God told them, don't look to yourselves, look up to the snake on the pole and live. And likewise, many religions, many people today think that they have a remedy to sin. Right? Do this thing, do that thing, pray hard enough, work harder for God, and you will somehow attain salvation by yourself. But it can't be us. It can never be us. Because if we start looking at ourselves and we look down to ourselves for some sort of solution, all we're going to see is more sin and more short-sighted goals that are not focused on heavenly things. We need to look to God. Right? We need to keep looking to the cross where our sin problem was absolved forever. We look to the cross because that's where Jesus tells us to look. Look to me and live. Because at the cross, we see our sin, but behind our sin, more importantly, we see our life. We see forgiveness that was won freely for us, that keeps our thoughts and our hearts focused on the goal for every Christian, and that's heaven. Because when we look up at the cross, suddenly all the problems we face on this earth have no eternal significance. When we keep looking up, we see God's love that went to the greatest lengths to save us. When we keep looking up, we see our hope and our future in heaven with our